For 9 years, Margaret Hale had lived as if she were poor. She lived in a small rented apartment, clipped coupons before grocery shopping, wore the same winter coat every year, and counted every dollar before paying a bill. At 72, she had become accustomed to saying, "I'm fine," whenever someone asked how she was doing. But on a rainy Tuesday morning, Margaret walked into First National Bank and quietly asked for a $6,000 personal loan. The banker looked at her application. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at the computer screen again. "Mrs. Hale," he said carefully, "may I ask why you need $6,000? Margaret swallowed. "My roof is leaking." The banker nodded. "That explains the loan, but it doesn't explain something else." "What?" He turned the screen toward her. "According to our records, you have access to a family trust worth approximately $28 million. Margaret stared at him. "That can't be right." The banker's expression changed. "It is." Margaret shook her head. "My son manages everything." "What is your son's name?" "Daniel." The banker typed something. A few seconds later, he leaned back. "Daniel Hale." "Yes. Your son has controlled this trust for 9 years. Margaret's hands began to tremble. "Controlled?" "Yes." The banker lowered his voice. "Mrs. Hale, why are you trying to borrow $6,000 when you appear to own access to $28 million? Margaret looked down at her worn handbag. "Because Daniel told me the money was gone." The banker went silent. Margaret continued. "He said my husband left debts. He said taxes consumed most of the estate. He told me there wasn't enough left for me to live comfortably." The banker stared at her. "Your husband died 9 years ago." "Yes. Your husband was Thomas Hale." Margaret nodded. The banker opened another document. "Mrs. Hale, Thomas Hale established a trust shortly before his death." "I know. Do you know what the trust says?" "No." "Did you ever sign paperwork giving Daniel complete control?" Margaret hesitated. "He said it was necessary. He told me I wouldn't understand the legal documents." The banker slowly stood. "Please wait here." 10 minutes later, a senior trust officer entered the room carrying a thick folder. She sat across from Margaret. "Mrs. Hale, I want to ask you something very important." "What?" "Have you received any annual statements from the trust?" "No." "Any tax documents?" "No." "Investment reports?" "No." "Distributions?" Margaret gave a bitter smile. "Daniel gives me $1,800 a month." The trust officer exchanged a glance with the banker. "Mrs. Hale, the trust has generated millions in investment income." Margaret's face went pale. "How much?" "Last year alone, approximately $1.7 million. Margaret could barely breathe. "And I received $21,600. "Yes." Margaret stared at the table. For 9 years, she had believed she was surviving on the generosity of her son. But apparently, she had been surviving on her own money. The trust officer opened the folder. "There's something else." "What?" "The trust does not give Daniel ownership." Margaret looked up. "He's the trustee. That means he has a legal duty to manage the assets for your benefit." "Then why did he tell me the money was gone?" "That is the question we need to answer." Margaret suddenly remembered something. 3 months after her husband's funeral, Daniel had brought her several documents. "Mom," he'd said, "Dad left everything complicated. Just sign here. I'll handle it." She had trusted him. He was her son, her only child. She had signed. The banker asked gently, "Mrs. Hale, do you have any idea what happened to the money?" Margaret shook her head. "No." The trust officer began examining the records. Within an hour, they found the first irregularity. Daniel had purchased a luxury condominium, then another property, then a sports car. There were transfers to a company called Hale Strategic Holdings. Margaret frowned. That was Daniel's company. Was it funded by the trust? "I don't know." The trust officer looked at the banker. "Yes." Margaret covered her mouth. "How much?" "Approximately $4.3 million. The room became completely silent. But that wasn't the worst part. There were additional transfers. $800,000 to an investment company. $1.2 million for a house in Arizona. $600,000 to an account belonging to Daniel's wife. And nearly $3 million in unexplained withdrawals. Margaret stared at the numbers. "My God," the banker said softly, "Mrs. Hale, this appears serious." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I trusted him. I know. He told me I was lucky he was taking care of me." The trust officer closed the folder. "You deserve to know exactly what happened." That afternoon, Margaret hired an attorney. For the first time in 9 years, she opened every document Daniel had kept from her. The truth was devastating. Her husband had left her $28 million. Not $2 million. Not $500,000. $28 million, and the trust had grown substantially since his death. Daniel had been living like a millionaire while allowing his mother to believe she was nearly broke. The attorney filed an emergency petition to remove him as trustee. Daniel arrived at court 3 days later. He looked angry rather than frightened. "Mom, what are you doing?" Margaret looked at him. "What I should have done 9 years ago. You don't understand these finances." "I didn't understand because you made sure I didn't." Daniel's face hardened. "I protected you. You stole from me." "I didn't steal anything." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Hale, your financial records will speak for themselves." Daniel became silent. Over the next several weeks, investigators examined every transaction. They discovered that Daniel had used millions of dollars from the trust to finance businesses, properties, vacations, and investments. Some investments had failed, others had made him even richer. He had never told his mother. The final accounting showed that approximately $11 million had been improperly transferred or spent. Margaret could hardly believe it. But there was one thing she couldn't understand. "Why?" she asked Daniel during a final private meeting. He looked away. "Dad always thought you were incapable of managing money." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And you believed him?" Daniel sighed. "I thought if I controlled everything, I could keep the family together." "No," Margaret said quietly. "You controlled everything because you wanted everything." Daniel didn't answer. The court removed him as trustee. A professional fiduciary took control of the remaining assets. Margaret finally received direct access to her accounts. Her attorney recovered millions through settlements and asset sales. But Margaret didn't buy a mansion. She didn't buy a sports car. She didn't suddenly become extravagant. Instead, she repaired her roof. Then she bought a modest house near the lake where she and Thomas had spent their honeymoon. She planted roses in the backyard. And every morning, she drank coffee on the porch. 6 months later, Daniel came to see her. He looked older. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" Margaret invited him inside. He sat across from her. "I'm sorry." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "I believe you are. I want to make things right. You can't make 9 years disappear." "I know." Margaret nodded. "But you can stop making them worse." Daniel began to cry. "I was afraid you'd leave me with nothing." Margaret's voice softened. "I would never have left you with nothing." She paused. "You were my son. I would have given you everything you genuinely needed." Daniel lowered his head. "But you wanted everything I had." He couldn't answer. Margaret stood and walked to the window. For 9 years, she had believed she was a poor widow dependent on her son. Now she understood something far more valuable than money. Being powerless and believing you are powerless are not always the same thing. Sometimes the person who controls the door wants you to forget that you have the key. And Margaret had finally found hers. A year later, she established a foundation in her husband's name. It helped elderly people who had been financially exploited by relatives. At the foundation's opening ceremony, a reporter asked her why she had chosen that cause. Margaret smiled. "Because sometimes the person you trust most is the person you never think to question." She looked toward the crowd. "And sometimes, asking one simple question can change your entire life." The reporter asked, "What question?" Margaret smiled. "Where did my money go?" And somewhere in the audience, her son sat quietly, finally understanding that his mother had never been helpless. She had simply trusted him. And trust, once broken, is worth far more than $28 million to replace.